I still remember the first time the pipe screamed. It wasn't the usual groan of steel under pressure. It sounded alive, like something breathing through the metal. They told me every pipeline beneath the North Sea has its own rhythm, but ours had a heartbeat. When I joined the maintenance crew, the supervisor handed me a folded, oil-stained sheet titled 11 Rules for Survival. I thought it was a joke, until one of the men vanished inside Pipe 7. We never found him. Now whenever I hear that low hum rising again, I remember how I broke the first rule, and what crawled out after. When I first joined the North Sea maintenance crew, I didn't take much seriously, least of all a list of old superstitions taped to a corroded locker door. It was my second night shift, the kind that blurs into the cold hiss of salt water and diesel fumes. When Mason leaned close and told me, Rule 1, never enter a pipe when it hums, no matter who's calling from inside. His voice was steady, but his eyes darted toward the dark steel tunnels behind us. I laughed, assuming he was just breaking in the rookie, but the way he didn't smile back told me it wasn't a joke. The pipes stretched for miles beneath the platform, carrying crude, chemicals, and God knows what else through the black water. We called them arteries, because when you stood inside one during inspection, it felt like being swallowed. The sound of pressure shifting was constant, a low vibration that pulsed through the soles of your boots. Mason said it was normal, that the ocean pressed down harder out here, that the pipes learned to breathe with it. That word, breathe, stayed with me longer than it should have. I didn't know then that he meant it literally. 2 nights later, we were assigned to clear a blockage in Sector 4. The pressure readings had spiked, and the control room wanted a visual check. Mason and I suited up and descended into the access tunnel, flashlights cutting through fog that smelled like rust and brine. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became, until even the ocean felt like it was holding its breath. Mason kept his hand on the wall, feeling the pulse through the metal. If you ever hear the hum, he whispered, you stop, you turn back. Doesn't matter who's inside. I wanted to ask what he meant, but he suddenly stopped walking. His light froze on the curve ahead. At first I thought it was static in my headset, a faint vibration, like distant machinery. But then I realized it was coming from the walls themselves, a deep resonant note that seemed to rise from inside the steel. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't pressure, it sounded almost aware. Mason's face turned pale behind his visor. That's it, he muttered. That's the hum. I stood there, confused, until a second sound joined it, a voice muffled and echoing, calling my name from deep within the pipe. It was too clear, too human to mistake. That's Chris, I said, my throat tightening. He went in an hour ago. Mason grabbed my arm so hard I dropped the torch. He's gone. Don't answer. The hum rose higher, vibrating through the air, shaking dust from the ceiling bolts. My radio hissed with overlapping voices. Chris's voice, then mine, repeating back words I hadn't said yet. I wanted to run, but something about the sound made my legs lock. It was rhythmic, hypnotic, like the ocean had found a way to sing through metal. Mason yanked me backward, shouting into the comms for the hatch to open. I heard footsteps echoing inside the pipe now, slow and deliberate, as if someone was crawling toward us. Then came the whisper, "Help me, please." And I swear it came from right beside my ear, though Mason was still in front of me. We stumbled out of the tunnel and slammed the hatch behind us. The hum cut off instantly, like a heartbeat stopping mid-beat. The silence that followed was almost worse. Mason leaned against the wall, breathing hard, his face slick with sweat. Chris knew the rules, he said finally, almost to himself. He shouldn't have answered it. I wanted to ask where Chris had gone, if he was still inside, but Mason shook his head. If the pipe hums, he said again, it means something's moving through it that isn't supposed to be there. I didn't press further, not that night. Back in the control room, the supervisors logged the incident. As a sensor misread, claiming pressure flux caused the acoustic anomaly. Mason didn't argue, and I followed his lead. But as we removed our suits, I noticed something that made my stomach twist: streaks of black oil across my gloves that shimmered faintly under the light, as if tiny veins pulsed within it. Mason saw it too, and without a word, he grabbed a rag, wiped my hands, and threw it into the incinerator chute. "You don't keep what the pipes give you," he said. "Not ever." I didn't know if he was being dramatic or afraid, but I understood one thing. The rules weren't superstition, they were survival. That night, I couldn't sleep. The walls of my bunk vibrated faintly with the ocean's movements, a reminder of how deep we were. At one point, I swore I heard the hum again, softer this time, as if coming from the ventilation system. I sat up, holding my breath. Then faintly, a voice, my name again, whispering from the air ducts. I climbed down and followed the sound into the corridor, half asleep, half scared. The hallway lights flickered. The hum grew louder, the closer I got to the maintenance hatch. I stopped, staring at it, frozen. Then I remembered Mason's words and backed away. When I turned, I saw wet footprints leading the other way, ending right outside my door. The next morning, Chris's name was removed from the active roster. No announcement, no explanation, just erased. Mason refused to talk about it, and everyone else acted like he'd never existed. But the hum came back during inspection later that week, faint but familiar, echoing through the steel like a heartbeat. I didn't answer it. None of us did. Yet when I looked at the pipeline logs later, I noticed an entry under his name. After what happened with Chris, I stopped asking questions. But curiosity has a way of festering down here, growing stronger in the dark. 3 days after the hum returned, our supervisor assigned me to pressure test valve 9 on the secondary line. Mason hesitated before handing me the work order. "You remember Rule 2? Never open a valve unless you can see both ends of the line, right?" I nodded, pretending I did. Truthfully, I didn't even know which valve that rule referred to. The schematics showed nothing unusual about it, but Mason's tone made my stomach knot. The secondary line ran parallel to the main transport artery, a narrow tunnel barely big enough to crawl through. The air was thick with the stench of oil and stagnant seawater. My flashlight beam cut through the fog, bouncing off the wet metal walls that seemed to breathe in and out, slow and steady. The valve was a massive rusted wheel embedded in the pipe junction, its surface slick with condensation. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I turned on my comms and told Mason I was in position. His response came back delayed, crackling, almost drowned by static. "Don't open it unless I say so." Then the line went dead. I stared at the valve, my gloved hand hovering over it. The gauge beside it flickered, pressure readings, jittering like a pulse out of rhythm. Something inside the pipe was shifting. I could hear it, faint and liquid, like movement behind a wall. I tapped the metal with my wrench, and the sound echoed deeper than it should have, like there was more space in there than the blueprint allowed. The silence that followed was heavy, thick, almost expectant. Then just for a second, I thought I saw condensation swirl across the valve's surface, like breath against glass. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired. The hum hadn't returned, and without Mason's voice on comms, I felt stupid standing there, frozen in front of an old wheel. So I turned it. Slowly, the moment it loosened, the pipe shuddered under my boots. A hiss of air escaped, not pressurized gas, but something wetter, heavier. The smell hit me next: brine and decay, like rotting fish left in stagnant water. I slammed the valve shut and stumbled backward, coughing into my respirator. My flashlight flickered, and for half a second, I saw something glisten between the bolts. Not water, but something black and gelatinous, sliding back into the seam. When Mason's voice finally returned on the comms, it was low and urgent. "Tell me you didn't open it." I hesitated just long enough for him to curse. "You shouldn't have done that. The line's not supposed to connect to anything anymore." He told me to leave immediately, but I stayed long enough to see the pressure gauge spike again, higher than before. As I crawled back toward the hatch, the pipe walls began to tremble, like something large was forcing its way through from the other side. I moved faster, every nerve in my body screaming, the vibration chasing me down the tunnel like footsteps under the floor. When I emerged, Mason sealed the hatch behind me without a word. We stood there, breathing hard, listening as the pipes rattled on the other side. After a few seconds, the sound stopped, leaving only the dull creak of metal under strain. Mason turned toward me, his face pale. "That line," he said quietly, "was supposed to be disconnected after the accident. The one before you came." I wanted to ask what accident he meant, but he just walked away. Later, when I checked the records, I found that Valve 9 didn't exist anymore on any of the new maps. It was erased, like it had never been installed. That night, while logging the inspection report, I noticed something strange. The system automatically generated a maintenance note under my ID, but I hadn't entered it. It read "Flow resumed, line reconnected." The timestamp matched the exact moment I turned the valve. I deleted it immediately, but an hour later, it reappeared again, this time with a new note: "Inbound confirmed, awaiting clearance." The words didn't make sense, but the phrasing "inbound" felt deliberate, like a message from the system itself. I unplugged the console, thinking it was a glitch. When I turned around, the terminal screen flickered once more, showing a live feed from somewhere deep inside the line, and something was moving. It was hard to make out through the distortion, but the shape was unmistakably human, crawling slowly toward the camera, the light glinting off wet skin. The feed cut out before I could react. I called Mason, but he didn't answer. The rest of the crew was asleep. For the first time since joining, I felt completely alone down here, surrounded by miles of breathing metal and water pressing in from all sides. I didn't know if I had released something, or if I had simply reminded it that we were still here. But the next morning, the gauges on every valve started pulsing, like a heartbeat coming from below. The day after the Valve 9 incident, the cameras started glitching. It wasn't unusual. Salt, moisture, and pressure often fried the feeds. But this time, it felt different. The outages weren't random. They happened in a pattern, one after another, like something crawling along the network. Mason noticed first, muttering that the dark feeds always meant movement. I remembered him warning me. Rule 3, never look directly into the inspection cameras when the feed goes dark. He said it with the same tone you'd use when telling someone not to stare into a storm. I didn't understand why, until later that night, when the lights flickered and I saw my own reflection blink back from a dead monitor. The control room was empty, except for me. It was my turn for night watch, the quiet shift no one wanted. Rows of flickering monitors lined the walls, each showing a different section of the undersea pipeline network. The hum of the generators filled the silence. For hours, nothing happened, just the rhythmic dance of static and flickering redouts. Around 2:13 a.m., one of the feeds cut to black. Sector 6, the same area connected to the secondary line, the one I had accidentally reopened. I leaned closer, tapping the screen to check for signal loss, but the blackness wasn't complete. Something shimmered faintly in the corner, like the reflection of water moving behind glass. I should have followed the rule and looked away, but curiosity is a slow kind of poison. I reached out and adjusted the brightness, my face inches from the monitor. The faint shimmer grew clearer, not water, but movement. A hand pressed against the camera lens from the other side. My stomach turned cold. The fingers were thin, translucent, like they'd been soaked for weeks. They flexed once, then slid down the glass, leaving behind a wet smear. I stumbled back, knocking over my coffee. The screen flashed white for a second, and then I saw myself. My own face, staring back from inside the pipe. I froze. The me on the screen didn't move the same way I did. Its head tilted slightly too slow, its expression a half-second delayed. It felt like watching a puppet try to mimic its puppeteer. I blinked, and the other me smiled. Just once. Then the feed cut out again. The room plunged into static, and every monitor along the wall flickered to black, one after another, like a wave rolling toward me. I grabbed the emergency radio and called Mason. No answer. The only sound left was the faint hiss of electricity and my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I didn't realize the reflection was still there until the emergency light flicked on, and I saw that faint, wet imprint of a hand on the outside of the monitor glass. Mason arrived 20 minutes later, half-dressed and furious. When I told him what I'd seen, he didn't argue or question, just shut down the entire grid for a manual reset. "You looked, didn't you?" he said quietly, and I nodded. He rubbed his temples, muttering something about signal bleed and visual contamination. I didn't understand what those meant until he explained. Sometimes, when the feed goes dark, it's not because of a malfunction. It's because something else is watching through it. It mimics the last person who stared too long, he said. That's why the rule exists. I wanted to call bullshit, but the tremor in his hand said otherwise. Later that night, I couldn't shake the image. My reflection, smiling, burned behind my eyes every time I blinked. The hallway outside my bunk was silent, but I swore I heard a faint hum of electronics, like the sound of monitors running even when switched off. I walked past the control room just once, glancing through the glass. The main feed screens were still down, glowing faintly gray, but as I passed, one of them flickered to life for half a second, just enough for me to see a figure sitting in my chair. Same uniform, same headset, staring into the dark feed. Then it turned its head toward me, slow and deliberate. I didn't sleep after that. Mason stayed in the control room for the next 2 shifts, keeping the cameras off, except for critical sections. But I noticed something strange in the log files. Every time we powered the system down, the feed for Sector 6 still showed new data packets being transmitted. No visuals, just streams of binary code at random intervals, like a heartbeat made of numbers. When I decrypted a fragment of one, it formed a string of repeating text. "Let me out." I deleted the file immediately, but a few minutes later, the same phrase appeared again, this time written across the static of the offline screen. By morning, everyone had noticed the smell, faint salt, like seawater that had seeped into the wiring. The techs found no leaks, no corrosion, no explanation. Mason just looked tired, older somehow. "We keep the feeds off," he said finally. "If the dark wants to see us, let it stare alone." But even as he said it, I saw his reflection in the... After the camera incident, Mason locked down half the network. Most of the crew didn't complain. The less time staring at screens, the better. But out here, nothing stays still for long. The deeper lines started to lose pressure again, readings fluctuating like a pulse out of rhythm. When we finally traced it, the fault pointed to the lower tunnels, the old maintenance corridors that hadn't been inspected in years. As Mason briefed me, he said it almost casually. Rule 4, never follow the sound of dripping water in the lower tunnels. I didn't ask why. I just nodded, pretending not to hear the faint drip echoing from somewhere beneath the floor. The descent to the lower levels always felt wrong. The air changed, heavier, colder, like stepping into the lungs of something sleeping. The walls were slick with condensation, water trailing down in thin rivulets that never dried. My flashlight beam wavered over the rusted metal, catching flashes of what looked like scratches, hundreds of them, carved into the panels. I couldn't make out the words, only repetitions of shapes, almost like tally marks. The further I went, the more I noticed a rhythm to the sound of dripping. Too steady, too deliberate to be natural. It wasn't water falling, it was pacing. Halfway through the corridor, my radio hissed with static. Mason's voice cut in, low and sharp. "Stop moving. Where are you?" I told him I was near junction D12, checking the pressure valve. There was silence. then get back up. Now. Before I could respond, the static bled into another sound, a faint, steady drip directly behind me. I turned slowly. The flashlight beam landed on the tunnel floor, where small puddles had gathered in uneven circles. The drops fell in perfect intervals, hitting the metal with the precision of a metronome, but the ceiling above was dry. I crouched, tracing the trail of moisture with my glove. It led down the corridor, turning toward a sealed hatch marked out of service. My instincts told me to leave, but curiosity whispered louder. I told myself I'd just take a look, nothing more. As I got closer, the dripping grew louder, not echoing, but coming from inside the hatch. Then something else, breathing, shallow, wet, like someone just beneath the surface of water. I took a step back, but the hatch handle twitched, once, then again. Then it began to turn on its own. I froze, light trembling in my hand, every nerve screaming to run. The hatch didn't open all the way, just enough for a sliver of darkness to seep out, carrying a smell so foul it felt alive. I lifted my flashlight, aiming into the gap. For a moment I saw movement, pale shapes shifting just beyond reach, like something crawling along the inner wall. Then in the beam's edge, a hand slid into view. It was swollen, skin translucent, nails torn to the quick. It rested against the metal lip, fingers twitching weakly. And then I heard the drip again. Not from above, but from the wrist itself. Water was leaking from the flesh, clear and endless. I stumbled backward, slamming into the opposite wall. The hatch creaked open another inch, and the sound of breathing grew louder, but not from inside anymore. It was behind me. I turned, and for a split second, I saw someone standing in the beam of my flashlight. They wore a worker's uniform, soaked through, their hair plastered to their forehead. Their face was pale, bloated, eyes unfocused, like they were underwater. I blinked, and they were gone. Only the dripping remained, steady and mocking. My radio flared back to life. Mason's voice was shouting my name, telling me to get out before it noticed. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran. My boots splashed through. After the dripping incident, I started sleeping with earplugs in. It didn't help much. Down here, silence doesn't exist. It's just noise waiting to be noticed. The ocean presses against every wall, whispering through vents and metal seams. That's why when the intercom crackled to life at 12:04 a.m., I thought it was just feedback from the storm above. But then I heard Mason's voice, soft and uneven, saying my name over and over. I froze halfway out of bed, remembering what he'd told me earlier that week. Rule 5. Never answer the intercom after midnight, even if it uses a familiar voice. His warning suddenly didn't feel like superstition. It felt like a test I wasn't supposed to fail. The sound was faint, like someone whispering through a long metal pipe. "You awake?" it said, almost kind. The voice was identical to Mason's, right down to the rasp in his throat. "We've got a pressure leak on level 3. I need you to come help me seal it." I checked the clock. 12:07. Mason had gone topside earlier. I watched him leave on the last transport. I grabbed my radio and tried to respond, but the channel was dead. The only sound was the voice on the intercom, now quieter, more insistent. "Please, hurry." Something in the way it said, "please," felt wrong, too practiced, too hollow. I stared at the intercom speaker. The static around the words had a pulse to it, faint but rhythmic, like a heartbeat buried in white noise. I forced myself to step closer, pressing my ear against the metal. What I heard wasn't breathing or machinery. It was dripping, slow and steady, echoing like it was coming from deep inside the pipes. My stomach twisted. I stepped back, grabbed my flashlight, and killed the room's main breaker. The intercom went silent immediately, cutting the voice mid-sentence. For a few seconds, I stood there in total darkness, heart hammering. Then from the other side of the wall, a whisper, not from the speaker this time, but inside the metal. "Why did you turn off the lights?" The lights flickered back on by themselves a second later. I didn't touch the switch. The intercom glowed faintly red, even though it was disconnected. My name came through again, but not Mason's voice this time. It was mine, flat, cold, emotionless. "You shouldn't ignore a call for help," it said. The sound crawled under my skin. I backed away until I hit the far wall. My reflection in the porthole window looked wrong, the mouth slightly open, moving a half beat before the words came through the intercom. I didn't blink. Neither did it. The next morning, I found Mason in the mess hall, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling. Before I could say anything, he asked, "It called you, didn't it?" I nodded. He sighed and rubbed his temples. "It always calls after someone opens a line they shouldn't," he said quietly. "Once you answer, it learns your voice." He told me about a worker named Dalka, who'd answered a similar call months ago. The day after, every intercom on the rig started broadcasting her voice, from storage rooms, engine bays, even the deep tunnels. She'd vanished 3 days later, but her voice never stopped calling for help. That night I turned off every intercom in my section, just to be safe. But as I lay awake, I could still hear faint static from the walls, like the system was breathing behind the panels. At 12:01 a.m., the light on the intercom in my cabin blinked once. I stared at it, holding my breath. Then the static faded into silence. No voice, no sound, nothing. I almost convinced myself it was over, until I heard the faintest whisper, right beside my ear, not from the speaker, but from the air itself. "It's okay," it said softly. "You can talk now." I ripped the cord from the wall and threw the intercom to the floor. The light stayed on, glowing faintly red against the metal. I covered it with my blanket and sat there until dawn. When Mason checked on me the next morning, he found the blanket soaked through with seawater, though no leaks were anywhere in the room. "It tried again, didn't it?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The intercom light behind him blinked twice, like it was listening. The first time the lights flickered, I thought it was just the storm again. The ocean above us was angry that night. Waves pounding the hull, wind howling through every pipe and vent. But this flicker was different. It wasn't random. It came in a pattern. 3 short pulses, a pause, then 2 long ones. Morse code, maybe. Mason and I exchanged a look through the glass of the control room. "You see that too?" he said quietly. Before I could respond, the power dipped again, and the low hum of the generator faltered into silence. We were told to wait for maintenance, but the emergency lights didn't kick in. I grabbed a flashlight. Mason shook his head slowly. "You remember Rule 6. Never go alone into the generator bay when the lights flicker." I told him I wouldn't. I lied. The generator bay is 4 decks below sea level, the lowest habitable part of the rig. When the main power dies, everything down there goes quiet, like the ocean itself is holding its breath. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, catching motes of dust that floated like tiny creatures suspended in water. The air smelled metallic, faintly burnt. As I descended the last ladder, I noticed condensation dripping from the overhead pipes, forming slow ripples in puddles below. Except one puddle wasn't rippling. It was perfectly still, like glass. Half the bay was in shadow. The other half glowed dimly from a single failing bulb that swung back and forth, casting long, nervous shadows across the turbines. I called Mason on the radio. No response. I called again. Still silence. Then through the static, I heard a low hum, not from the radio, but from the floor beneath me. A vibration, deep and irregular, like something large was breathing through the metal. I crouched, pressing my hand against the deck. The hum grew stronger. Something inside the generator casing pulsed once, hard enough to rattle the tools on the wall. Then it stopped. I stood there in the half-dark, flashlight shaking in my hand, and noticed something strange on the far side of the room. The reflection from the swinging bulb didn't match the light's movement. When the bulb swung left, the reflection stayed still. When it swung right, the reflection twitched. like something else was moving in sync, but out of rhythm. I took one step closer. The puddle beneath the reflection rippled, though the air was still. That's when I heard Mason's voice over the radio, faint and distorted. "Don't move," he said. "I can see you on the camera feed. You're not alone down there." I turned toward the security camera in the corner. Its red light was on, except I knew that entire system was powered by the generator. It shouldn't have been working at all. My pulse spiked. "Who's down here?" I whispered. The radio crackled again, but it wasn't Mason this time. The voice that came through was my own, repeating what I'd just said. Only a half second later, I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight on the puddle. The reflection still stood there, unmoving, head tilted. Then, with a sound like metal grinding underwater, the reflection stepped forward, but the floor beneath it didn't ripple. It wasn't touching the water, it was inside it, like the puddle was a window instead of a surface. I turned and ran for the ladder, every footstep echoing like gunfire in the dark. Behind me, I heard the soft splash of something climbing out of the puddle. By the time I reached the second deck, the power surged back on, flooding the rig with cold white light. The hum of the generator returned, steady this time, normal. Mason met me at the hatch, face pale. "You shouldn't have gone," he said flatly. I asked if he saw what I saw. He didn't answer. He just pointed at my boots, dripping wet with seawater, and then at the dry metal floor beneath me. Later, reviewing the camera footage, we found a 4-minute blackout gap. No video, no sound. But right before the feed cuts, there's a single frame, a figure standing behind me in the bay, pale and featureless, its head tilted the same way as the reflections. Mason froze the image and turned to me slowly. "You remember what the flickering meant, right?" he whispered. I shook my head. He leaned closer, voice barely audible. "It means it's still trying to find the power source." That night, every light in my cabin. 2 days after the generator incident, things aboard the rig went strangely quiet. No one spoke about what happened. Not officially, at least, but there was a heaviness in the air, like the steel itself remembered what we'd seen. The crew avoided the lower decks entirely, leaving tools and half-finished repairs behind. Even Mason, who'd always kept his composure, looked haunted. He told me we were moving deeper into the inspection grid, closer to the old auxiliary line that hadn't been active since the 90s. I didn't ask why. That night, while I was making rounds, he stopped me at the hatch leading to the pressure corridor. "If you hear knocking from the other side," he said, voice low and tight, "don't answer it. Don't even look. You remember Rule 7, never respond to a knock from inside the pressure door." The pressure corridor was narrow, lined with heavy watertight doors, painted dull red, each marked with warning symbols faded by salt and time. The air there always felt denser, like the ocean pressing against the walls wanted in. I walked slowly, flashlight in one hand, checklist in the other. Most of the doors were sealed shut, bolts rusted in place. But when I reached door 9, the one connecting to the abandoned southern pipeline chamber, I noticed fresh condensation running down its center seam. I wiped it with my glove. It was cold, too cold. I stood there listening, the hum of the rig faint in the distance, when I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock. 3 taps, then silence. I froze. The sound hadn't come from my side. It came from inside the chamber, the one sealed since before I'd been assigned here. I took a step back, heart hammering. Maybe it was the metal contracting, I told myself, or pressure shift, anything logical. Then the knocks came again, slower this time, deliberate, almost polite. I wanted to call Mason, but my radio gave nothing but static. The knocks continued, 5 this time, then 2 more, like someone trying to form a pattern. My hand twitched toward the door handle before I caught myself. Never respond. I repeated it in my head, over and over, grounding myself with the words, and then the voice came. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, a voice I knew. "Open the door, please." it said. Mason's voice. Calm, steady, just like him. It's jammed from this side. I need your help. My throat went dry. Mason was on shift with me, but I'd just left him in the upper bay 5 minutes ago. I swallowed hard, backing away from the door. Mason, I whispered. Even though I knew I shouldn't speak, the voice answered immediately. Only this time it sounded closer. Yeah, I need you to pull the lever. I stared at the thick bolts sealing the door. Water was leaking now. Slow drips from the hinges. Not a flood, just enough to glisten under my flashlight. That's when I realized the sound of the voice didn't echo like it should have through the metal. It was flat, like it was coming from inside my own head. The drips grew faster, forming a thin stream that coiled toward my boots. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and then the voice spoke again. Sharper this time, impatient. You're wasting time. Open it. I turned and ran. Halfway down the corridor, I heard the sound. I'll never forget, the pressure bolts twisting on their own, metal grinding against metal, deep and wet. Then a pop, followed by a hiss, and the shriek of air being sucked through the seal. I didn't look back, but I heard something heavy dragging across the floor behind that door, scraping against steel like it was testing its new limbs. When I reached the ladder, the entire rig shuddered once, a deep vibration that rattled every pipe around me. I burst into the control deck, gasping for breath. Mason looked up from the monitor. What happened to you? He asked, genuine confusion on his face. I pointed toward the corridor, but he frowned. We sealed that section hours ago. There's no pressure access there. He turned the monitor toward me. A live feed from the hallway. The pressure door I'd been at was visible in perfect clarity. No leaks, no movement, just stillness. I could see my own flashlight lying there, abandoned, beam still glowing. Then on the screen, the flashlight flickered, once, twice, and turned toward the camera on its own. Mason leaned closer, eyes wide. That's not possible, he whispered. And right before the feed cut to black, the door behind the flashlight bulged outward, like something inside had pressed its weight against it, just for a second. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing faint taps echoing through the pipes, even though the corridor was sealed and flooded the next morning. But what unsettled me most wasn't the sound. By the time we reached the 8th week under the North Sea, everyone was starting to unravel. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts, interrupted by strange noises, not loud enough to be alarms, but enough to jolt you awake with your heart racing. The ocean has a way of whispering through steel, carrying sounds from places you'd rather not imagine. Mason told me to keep busy, to focus on mechanical tasks, but it didn't help. Every deck smelled faintly of brine and oil, and lately, something else, something sweet, like rot mixed with salt. That morning, the surface team reported movement readings near the old extraction shaft, a section sealed off after a collapse years ago. The moment Mason heard it, he turned to me sharply. You remember Rule 8? Never touch anything that floats up from the old extraction shaft, no matter what it looks like. The shaft was an open vertical conduit, descending more than 200 meters into blackness. We weren't supposed to go near it. Even walking past made the pressure gauges twitch. The crew used to joke that the sea itself was breathing through that hole, but when the sonar picked up solid objects rising from it, Command ordered a retrieval inspection. Standard procedure. Mason and I argued against it, but orders were orders. We suited up and went down to the retrieval bay, where the waterline pulsed against the reinforced glass like a heartbeat. The first object surfaced an hour later, a torn piece of netting tangled around what looked like coral. Except coral doesn't twitch when you shine a light on it. The retrieval claw reached for it, and as soon as the metal touched, every monitor in the room glitched. Screens flashing static, gauges spiking. The coral mass shifted, revealing something underneath. A fragment of a deep-sea diving helmet, old and rusted but shaped wrong. The faceplate bulged outward, like something had tried to push its way through from the inside. Mason ordered the arm retracted immediately. The claw began to rise, carrying the thing toward the containment tank. That's when I saw the hand. It wasn't human, pale, translucent, with webbing between the fingers, but it moved with purpose, gripping the edge of the claw like it recognized the machine holding it. I shouted to cut power, but the claw froze halfway up. The lights dimmed. A soft thud echoed from the shaft, followed by another, like something climbing up after it. Mason hit the emergency override, and the arm dropped the object back into the water. The hand slipped beneath the surface without a ripple. Then everything went still. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the alarm lights blinked green again. "All clear. False signal," Mason said. "System interference." But I could tell he didn't believe it. When we left the bay, I noticed water pooling near the hatch, thin trails leading toward the drainage grate. They shimmered faintly, reflecting my flashlight like mercury. Later that night, when I went to log the incident, I found a small piece of coral sitting on my desk, not wet, perfectly dry. I called Mason immediately, but he didn't answer, so I wrapped it in a rag and took it to the disposal chute. The chute's airlock hisses before opening. It's meant for biohazard waste. But when I dropped the coral inside, the hatch refused to close. The console blinked. Foreign object detected. I leaned in to check, and the rag moved, slowly, like something inside was breathing. I slammed the emergency flush button, and the chute sealed with a deafening clang. The system registered a full purge, pressure differential confirming the release into the ocean. But that wasn't the end of it. 2 hours later, I woke to the sound of dripping. At first I thought it was condensation again, until I noticed the puddle forming under my bunk. Thick, dark, and smelling faintly of salt. The water rippled once, and a small white object floated to the surface, the same coral fragment I'd flushed into the deep. Only this time, something was growing from it. Tiny translucent veins, pulsing faintly with light, stretching toward my boots, like roots searching for soil. I backed away and hit the alarm, but nothing happened. No sound, no light. By the time we reached the 9th week, the sea felt heavier. The storms on the surface were worse. The pressure readings fluctuated for no reason, and half the crew looked like they hadn't slept in days. The hum of the rig, normally steady and comforting, now carried an uneven rhythm, almost like it was breathing with us. Mason had grown quieter too. He kept checking the time, glancing at the clocks every hour on the hour, as though waiting for something. One night, just before midnight, he looked up from the console and said softly, "You remember Rule 9, never turn off the external floodlights after midnight. Whatever's out there doesn't like the dark any more than we do." I laughed nervously, but he didn't even smile. The floodlights were our only window to the outside world. They shone into the endless black water, cutting beams through the silt and drifting plankton. When you stared long enough, you could almost trick yourself into seeing shapes moving just beyond the light's reach. Most guys avoided looking too long. We called it deep staring, and it could make even the sanest man lose sense of what was real. But when you're surrounded by that kind of darkness, light feels like safety, even if it barely keeps the shadows at bay. That night, however, the generator was straining again. Command ordered a partial power cut to preserve fuel, which meant shutting down non-essential systems. Someone on the surface sent the override code to the lights. They went out all at once. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Without the constant hum of power and glow of the floodlights, the ocean pressed in closer, like a living thing reclaiming its space. I stood at the observation window, watching the void swallow everything beyond the glass. My reflection looked back at me faintly in the dark, pale and distorted by the faint emergency lights inside. I was about to turn away when I saw something move behind my reflection. Slow, fluid, massive. It wasn't drifting. It was circling. "Mason," I whispered. He was already running diagnostics. "I'm seeing movement outside the west viewport." He didn't even look up. "Don't engage the searchlights," he muttered, voice low and strained. "If they're drawn to the dark, we don't want to show them where we are." Then faintly, there was a flash, not from our lights, but from below. A dull blue glow pulsed deep in the water, like bioluminescence, only stronger, rhythmic. Another pulse followed, closer this time. The entire room shuddered, as if something enormous had brushed against the hull. Tools fell from racks, monitors flickered, and the deep groan of metal under strain echoed through the deck. I stumbled back, gripping the railing. The blue light passed over the viewport again, and for a brief second, I saw it. A shape. No, a silhouette, pressed against the glass from outside. Humanoid, but wrong. The limbs were too long, the fingers tapering like strands of kelp, moving lazily as if in slow motion. Its head tilted, following my movement exactly, until it seemed to mimic my stance perfectly. Then it smiled. I didn't even know something that deep could smile. Mason shouted for me to get away from the window. He slammed the emergency relight button, but nothing happened. The system denied power restoration until the surface override cleared. He cursed under his breath, grabbed a portable floodlight, and ran toward the access ladder to the observation bay. "Stay here," he barked. I didn't argue. I could barely breathe. The shape outside lingered another moment before fading into the dark, its glow dissipating like ink in water. A minute later, the emergency lights flickered back on, pale and weak, but enough to see Mason through the corridor glass. He was halfway to the bay controls when something moved behind him, a shadow darker than the dark itself. I shouted his name, but he didn't react. He reached the manual switch and pulled it. The external floodlights roared back to life, flooding the ocean with blinding white beams, and then we saw them. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of shapes surrounding the rig. They weren't fish. They weren't even swimming. They hung motionless in the water, suspended upright, like people standing in an invisible field. Their bodies glowed faintly from within, pale blue veins threading through translucent skin. They all faced inward, toward the rig, toward us, the lights reflected off empty eyes. Dozens of them staring through the glass. Mason froze at the panel, eyes wide. I could see his hand tremble. By the time we reached the 10th week beneath the North Sea, silence had become the loudest thing on the rig. Every noise meant something now. The creak of pressure shifting, the hum of cables, the faint tapping in the pipes. Mason barely left the control deck anymore, sleeping in a chair beside the comms terminal. He said the surface relay had been glitching, sending back fragments of our own transmissions out of sequence. Echo bleed, he called it, but when I asked what that meant, he just looked at me for a long moment before muttering, "It means they're starting to learn how to talk." I didn't understand what he meant until that night, when I heard the first transmission come through the static. It wasn't random noise. It was me. That's when I remembered Rule 10. Never answer a transmission that uses your own voice. The voice on the comm was unmistakable. Same tone, same breathing, even the same background hum of machinery. "This is Deck 2. Pressure stable," it said. "Requesting a systems check confirmation." The words were mine exactly, recorded earlier in the day when I'd logged my inspection. Only this time, the system showed no active transmission from Deck 2. I was in the control room. I stared at the comm light blinking red. It waited. Whoever, whatever, was on the other side had stopped speaking. I felt Mason's eyes on me as I reached for the switch. He didn't have to say it. His expression said everything. "Don't." Then the voice came again, softer this time. "You there? It's cold down here." The temperature dropped 2 degrees instantly. The gauge confirmed it. My breath fogged in the air. The sound of my own voice echoed through the speakers again. More strained now, pressures rising. "Something's wrong with the seals." The tone was urgent, panicked, exactly like I'd sounded last week when we'd almost lost containment in the lower bay. But that recording had been deleted during system cleanup. It shouldn't exist. Mason shut off the speaker manually, muttering to himself. "It's fishing," he said. "Don't let it know you're listening." Hours passed with no further signals. We sat in silence, watching the dark sea on the monitors. The floodlights outside flickered once. Just once, but stayed steady. I must have dozed off in the chair because the next thing I remember was waking up to static again, faint and rhythmic. My name repeated softly through the noise. "Daniel, Daniel." It was my voice again, but the tone was wrong. Too slow, too deliberate, like something trying to mimic human speech. I leaned closer to the mic, hypnotized in spite of myself. The voice chuckled faintly, a sound I'd never made. "You shouldn't have sealed the shaft." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone I'd flushed the coral piece. Only Mason knew. I turned to him, but he was already standing by the comm unit, pale and trembling. "Don't respond," he whispered. "If you answer, it'll know where you are." I asked him what it was, but before he could answer, the transmission changed. A low hum filled the speakers, like pressure building underwater. Then the static cleared for a moment, and I heard myself screaming. Not over comms, not distorted, but real, raw, as if I were standing in that other place, hearing my own voice echo back through layers of steel and salt. It went on for several seconds before cutting abruptly to silence. Then faintly, the other voice, mine again, calm now, said, "I found him." The comm light flickered off. Neither of us spoke for almost an hour. Mason just stared at the equipment, muttering under his breath, "It's mapping the line." Later, when we checked the logs, we found something impossible. The transmission source had originated from inside the rig, somewhere between Deck 4 and the old extraction shaft. But the internal mics there had been offline for days. We sealed the line manually, welding the comm relay shut. For the rest of the night, I tried not to think about what the voice meant. I found him. Who was it talking about? Mason refused to discuss it. "It's not you, it's imitating," he finally said. "It's what's left of you, what it remembers." I didn't ask what that meant. The next morning, we received a priority transmission from the surface. The operator identified himself as Control Supervisor Harris, someone I'd spoken to dozens of times. But as soon as he began talking, I froze. The phrasing, the rhythm, it was too familiar. "This is Control," he said. "We've lost your signal integrity. Confirm your location." Mason's hand hovered over the mute switch. I whispered, "What if it's real?" He shook his head. "If it's real, they'll use the emergency code phrase." We waited. The voice paused. Then, perfectly matching my tone from earlier, it said, "It's cold down here." Mason didn't hesitate. He yanked the comm cables from the wall. The room plunged into silence again, save for the faint hum of the lights. But even disconnected, the speakers emitted one final burst of static. And in that last burst, just before the sound died completely, my voice whispered one last word, "Closer." We didn't sleep that night. I don't think Mason has slept since. Every now and then, when the generators settle and the hum of the rig aligns just right, I can hear faint echoes in the metal, voices under. The final hour of a shift on the trench rig is the longest 60 minutes of your life. Everything feels heavier. The pressure, the silence, even the air. That's when the ocean starts to press closer, like it knows you're about to leave. We always went quiet after 0200. No chatter, no status updates, no comm checks, just quiet. That was Rule 11. Never under any circumstance break radio silence during the final hour of the shift. It wasn't superstition, it was survival, because something down there listens when the noise stops, and it listens too closely when you speak. The first time I learned why, it was Mason who broke the rule. It was a slow night, the current steady, no readings from the lower sensors. He got restless, started humming through the headset while running diagnostics. Just a faint sound, not even words, but the comms flickered to life instantly. A distorted reply came through the static, matching his tune half a second out of sync. It was the delay that made it unbearable, like the ocean was thinking about what note to copy. Mason froze. I turned to look at him, and I'll never forget the expression on his face, like he already knew what he'd just called up. Then a second voice joined the hum. Not his, not mine. It came from the lower frequency channel, one we'd disabled weeks before. The voice was low, wet, like bubbles forming in a throat. It didn't say anything we could understand, just murmured in a rhythm that almost sounded like breathing. Then it stopped. The entire rig shuddered, not like a wave hit us, like something brushed against the hull. All the pressure gauges spiked, one after another, then dropped to zero in perfect sequence, like a pulse moving through the metal. We shut everything down, comms, lights, hydraulics, and waited in the dark. The only sound was the creak of steel contracting under cold water. Mason sat shaking, whispering to himself. It heard me, he said. It knows we're still here. After that night, we enforced radio silence religiously. No one dared whisper. No one even breathed too loud near the mics. But 2 weeks later, when new operators joined us from the surface, one of them, a kid named Porter, didn't take it seriously. It's just deep-sea paranoia, he laughed. Pressure gets in your head. Mason warned him not to test it. He didn't listen. On his second night, Porter opened comms at 2:37, 23 minutes before shift change. I was on the maintenance deck, replacing filters, when I heard his voice echo over the intercom. Rig control to surface. Come in, he said, just running a quick check. There was no response. Then a burst of static, then his voice again, but wrong, flat, monotone, empty. Control to surface, it repeated. Shift complete, all accounted for. The problem was, the shift wasn't over, and not all of us were accounted for. When I reached the control room, Porter was still at the console, headset on, staring blankly at the monitor. His eyes were open, but unfocused. Mason yanked the headset off. Porter didn't even flinch. The comm screen was flashing an incoming signal. Source Deck 7. That deck had been sealed since the pressure breach. We listened. The voice that came through was calm, familiar. It was Mason's. Shift complete, it said again. All accounted for. Then in Porter's tone, it added, confirmed. We tore the system offline. The sound didn't stop immediately. It just faded, like it was being dragged down into the static. When it finally went silent, Porter blinked for the first time in minutes, his face pale and wet with sweat. Did you hear it? He whispered. We didn't answer. For the next few days, everything seemed normal. Porter worked quietly, didn't speak much, avoided the comms deck entirely. But every night near the end of shift, just before 0300, he'd stop what he was doing and stare at the wall like he was listening to something only he could hear. I once caught him whispering under his breath, slow, careful syllables. I couldn't make out the words, but I swear I heard the faint click of his mic turning on. I shouted his name, and he jumped like I'd snapped him out of a trance. I didn't say anything, he insisted, but the comm indicator was still glowing red. Live. The next morning, his bunk was empty. His ID badge was found by the pressure lock, the one leading to the maintenance shaft that opens directly into the trench. The hatch was sealed from the outside. No alarms, no breach, no trace of him on the sensors. Mason just stared at the log file. The final entry was one sentence. Shift complete, all accounted for. We stopped using the radio after that. Now when the final hour comes, we just sit in silence, the hum of the rig keeping us company. Every so often, I swear I can still hear faint voices under the static, fragments of old transmissions, maybe, or maybe, just echoes from the deep, remembering us. And sometimes, when the minute hand hits 3 o'clock, the comms